Good afternoon and welcome to our first Ask the Auditor of 2025. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting from Wurundjeri and Bunurong country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we're talking about diversity, equity and inclusion, and with me today I've got Julie Van Belkom, our Senior Advisor in DEI at Audit Express. Welcome Julie, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Look, I suppose one of the first things I'd like to talk about is diversity, equity, inclusion. We hear DEI in the media. That's a topic du jour, especially in coming out of the United States at the moment. What is DEI all about?
Yeah, so diversity, equity, inclusion is really about looking at your organisation, looking at how diverse it is in terms of the people that work there, how equitable it is in terms of, for example, pay, and how inclusive it is in terms of making those diverse cultures and identities feel included in that workspace.
Now, we see a lot of organisations having targets for DEI and talking about DEI. What are some things organisations do to make sure they can comply with DEI or aspire to diversity, equity, inclusion in their organisations? Yeah,
it's a good question. I think looking at some key areas, gathering your data to start with, and looking at where you're sitting right now, which is where DEI auditing can come in really handy, giving you a bit of a current state of play, and seeing where you might be able to improve from that data and being able to set some key KPIs through your strategy, and that might look like, for example, equality in your leadership in terms of gender, or looking at increasing your First Nations employees. Just two examples of some strategies that you might be able to set from looking at your data and where you're at.
Absolutely. Now, there's obviously a lot of different KPIs that organisations might put in place in terms of DEI. You gave a couple of examples of that. How does auditing go about, or how do you go about auditing and measuring those sort of KPIs?
Yeah, I think when you're collecting the data, to start off with, whether you're surveying or just using your existing data, being able to monitor that over a period of time will show you what those trends are, and where you're setting those KPIs, it will allow you to work out whether you're meeting those KPIs or whether you need to adjust them, or what's getting in the way, what might be some barriers to you achieving that. And I think doing a follow-up audit will give you a good sense of what's happening there. What are the barriers? Why aren't you getting there? Or if you're overachieving, that's great. Maybe you didn't quite set them in the right space either.
Now, a lot of organisations probably haven't done a DEI audit before. What should they expect in auditing diversity, equity, inclusion in their organisation?
Yeah, it really starts with looking at some of those key intake moments. So looking at your recruitment, how are you recruiting? How are you advertising? Are you using inclusive practices in that? Are you attracting a diverse workforce? Looking at your recruitment team and their bias and how that's impacting on it as well. Looking at your policies and procedures, making sure that they're gender neutral or not really using gender to make sure that people feel included as well. They're probably some key things that can be looked at through a DEI audit. What have you seen when you've been auditing?
Great question. Look, I see a range of different things, and especially it depends in the context for those organisations. So, we've looked at organisations overseas, let's say in Vietnam, where gender equality is really a really important factor for a lot of organisations. In Australia, I think we're sort of starting to take things for granted, where we are seeing a lot more women in leadership. There's still a long way to go, and we're still a long way to go to have pay equality with women as well. But when we think back to, let's say, the 60s and 70s, we saw, even here in Australia, that once women got married, they weren't allowed to still participate in the workforce.
Yep.
And I think we've broken down a lot of those barriers and those sort of mores and norms that were okay back then, but we think back and go, well, that's not the Australia we live in now. And we look at countries overseas, Vietnam, as I gave an example, where there's still a lot of discrimination against women in leadership and participation in the workforce. So one of the things that I've seen, to answer your question, is depending on the organisation where they are in that context, is having clear KPIs and targets for inclusion and diversity for women, people with disabilities. We're seeing in more Western countries, we're seeing sexual identity and gender identity as well, which, again, from the United States, as we discussed before, a lot of noise coming out from there. Yeah. And in terms of organisations, what strategies have you seen work effectively to build inclusive workplace culture?
Yeah, I think a big part of it comes down to training. So, getting some inclusive leadership training for your key executive team can really help build that culture of leadership. And inclusivity, if that's a word, I'm sure it is. And making sure that your leadership team are really embodying that DEI space, but not training for training's sake either. I know that there's a lot of cultural safety training and unconscious bias training that can be a little bit I have to do this, every year or whatever. Whereas I think if it's really targeted to your organisation and what you want to get out of it, that training can be really impactful. So I think looking at what you're doing and how that training is impacting and what you want to achieve, I think will show the success for the organisation.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, just a reminder for those of you watching this live broadcast, you can actually provide us with some questions. Please use the comments section just below us there to ask any questions you want, and we'll have a bit more interactivity. But one of the things that you just mentioned now as well, which is really important, I suppose, in thinking about DI, is the unconscious biases that we have. Tell me more about how we can understand those and what unconscious bias is.
Yeah. Well, unconscious bias is those thoughts and sometimes words that we say that are really ingrained in us from our childhood or, any shape of life. And I think it's just really checking yourself on how that bias comes out. So, I'm a Caucasian woman and I obviously have some privilege as well. And it's really just about checking that privilege and how that might impact on the people that I'm speaking with, and making sure that I'm not speaking on behalf of people as well. I don't ever want to do that. And I think, it can be, it's really about just checking yourself and what that unconsciousness of our privilege is really saying. What about you?
Yeah, it's great because I think from an organisational perspective, it's about having or acknowledging that we have biases and those unconscious biases that we, again, that's why I suppose they're unconscious because we're not consciously thinking about them, is probably, when we look at it from a DEI perspective and auditing DEI is, what have organisations done to try and break down those biases or give an understanding? So, and you mentioned it before, I think training is one of those aspects. So I suppose from an auditing perspective, we might look at, what are the targets that or KPIs they've put in place, and what are the strategies they've put in place to try and combat or overcome those biases.
Yep.
Now, something that we did speak about earlier, and we were having a bit of a chat before the live broadcast, but we were talking about some red flags in organisations. So, some organisations, we've heard about greenwashing, but now there's also what we call diversity washing. What are some of those red flags of diversity washing that you've seen in auditing some of these organisations?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me is that tokenistic gesture of, celebrating International Women's Day, but really not paying your women equally, I think is probably one of the biggest ones that I see in social media as well as in research. And it is one of the red flags of people trying to show that they're inclusive, but it's not really coming through, and people don't feel included. And I think it's a space that you either really need to lock into it and really show that you're doing it. Otherwise, your people aren't going to feel included, and they will eventually leave if they're not feeling like they're in a safe space.
Now, in terms of that diversity washing, have well, we've obviously seen examples of it, but in your audit practice, have you seen organisations that have set targets but then just use those targets as, I suppose, the diversity washing to say, look how good we are, but then willfully do the wrong thing behind the closed door, so to speak?
I would say yes, and people like to use data in any number of different ways and make it, use that data to get across whatever they want to achieve, and I think it's really dangerous to do that. I've definitely seen it in auditing. I've seen it in organisations I've worked with as well, or worked for, where that data is skewed to look a certain way when it isn't actually that way. It's not something that I feel comfortable with at all. What about you? What have you seen?
Look, I've seen a lot. I think when we've been called in to do an audit, so we've done quite a few DI audits, and what I find is that if they are engaging us, they've actually got a genuine want to do the right thing.
Yep.
So while there's examples that we can say, well, look, here's their KPIs, they haven't been able to do what they want to do because they probably sometimes need a bit of guidance or a bit of a strategic thinking on how to actually approach it. Because I think mostly, most people do want to do the right thing. But that also, I suppose, one of the questions that came through earlier was, why do organisations do it? And I think that comes to the crux of it, the why. Why DEI?
Yeah.
Why do we have diversity, equity, inclusion? Is it just a throwaway catchphrase? Is it something that we need to ban, like the administration of the United States is saying, ban everything DEI? Or what are the actual benefits from it? So, and I know we were discussing this earlier. What do you think are the benefits of organisations implementing DEI?
Yeah, well, the benefits to their employees are just phenomenal. And I think, I've worked in organisations where I have personally, having a lived experience, have felt included and felt like my voice is warranted. And the engagement and the motivation and the loyalty that comes from that, you can't get that. And if you want to have an inclusive workplace, get on board. It's not difficult. It takes a little bit of time to get started, and it needs it needs the leadership team to get really involved in it, but it's not difficult, and it shouldn't be difficult.
And great point. And look, I suppose some of the things that I've seen in terms of benefits is not just about the happiness and productivity of employees. Obviously, that's a great bonus and a benefit, but it's also about recruiting the right people. And what I've found is, organisations, some organisations really struggle to recruit the right people in those jobs. And again, through those recruitment practices, they narrowed the what I call the gene pool of talent because they didn't go far and wide, and their own biases would prevent them from possibly employing someone with disabilities, for example. So whilst the disability had nothing to do with their performance in that job, they just couldn't see beyond the disability. So again, changing those biases, looking at targets, looking at different ways that they can recruit people. And some of the organisations we've worked with are now able to have a much wider pool to recruit from, and they're now employing the best people in the job and giving people opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity had it not been for breaking down those unconscious biases. I know we've sort of mentioned it a couple of times now about what's happening in the United States. There's change of administration. There's a whole rhetoric that goes with that. Where do you see the future of DI? What's your forecast for the next sort of year, 4 years at least?
Yeah, I hope that Australia doesn't go down the same path. However, what's happening in Queensland at the moment is a little concerning. I think I would love to see DEI be encompassed by many more organisations, and for them to use DEI auditing to see how they can actually, work with us to get to a space where they can and feel confident in doing it and feel like they've got the tools to be able to do it. As I said before, it's not difficult. You just need to, you need some help. A lot of organisations need a little bit of help. So I hope that it does become more of a it becomes more widely used in Australia than what it is now, and that it doesn't go backwards.
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Absolutely. And I suppose, the different jurisdictions, and I think the United States have mandated certain KPIs for larger organisations. Mm-hmm. Do you think mandating DEI is a good idea, or do you think that there might be this backlash as we're seeing, so that it should be a voluntary opt-in process or KPIs for organisations?
Yeah. My understanding, the government have also set some DEI targets as well, and I think it's actually a good thing if it's done in the right way. It's not going to stop the right people getting in the right job. It's just going to make sure that organisations actually stick to their targets. So I don't think it's a bad thing setting those targets and mandating it to make sure that we're getting there.
Excellent. Now, we've had a question come through that's asked, what's the benchmarks for training organisations? So, again, I suppose we're looking at RTOs and registered training organisations and universities in Australia. What are the sort of KPIs that you think they should be aiming for from a training organisation perspective?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting one, because when you're looking at training, you're also looking at your student cohort as well, and so looking at your organisation, your staff, but also looking at how you're recruiting students, how you're engaging with those students, and how included they feel in the experience of studying with you. And I think there's some really key things that you can do to, if you want to set targets and engage with, for example, if you want to increase your First Nations students, how do you go about that? What strategies can you put in place? Developing a RAP or a reconciliation action plan would be a really great start to being able to set some of those strategies. But how do you go about that? It's looking at making sure your tools are culturally safe, making sure that your classes are culturally safe, and calling out when someone is, not saying the right thing. But I think there's some really key benchmarks that you can set for both your student cohort and your staff.
Now, that's a great segue into another question that we've got. Registered training organisations in Australia are about to go through yet again another set of standards. Yep. So, as we know, the standards are changing, likely to change from the 1st of July. That's what the politicians and the departments are saying. And a key component of the new or the draft revised standards coming out includes the diversity, equity and inclusion of students and the student cohort. How can training organisations start implementing these DEI practices now that it is part of the standards will be part of the standards from July 1? Yeah,
it's a great question. I think I've got some ideas, but I think one of the key things is about making people feel included. So looking at how you're enrolling them or how you're recruiting them, what questions are you asking outside of, the ABITMA standards and the government questions that you need to ask. Are you asking for, their pronouns? Are you asking about their cultural background? All of those sorts of things. And what are you doing with that information? Are you able to implement, if someone gives you their pronouns, how is that being shared? Providing support services for people, setting up, groups if you can. If you've got enough students, setting up little groups so that they can deal with each other, making sure that your facilities are disability friendly, making sure your materials are gender neutral. There's lots of different things that I think organisations can do to look at that space. What about you? What have you sort of thought about?
And look, I've been talking to a lot of training organisations about this as well, in preparation for the new revised standards or the draft revised standards being implemented from 1 July. And one of the things as well that we've noticed, which is a challenge for a lot of organisations, are people with disabilities, and making sure that there's equal access to learning resource and facilities. So not only the built environment, so built environment's very important, because there's still a lot of organisations and institutes which aren't necessarily DDA compliant. So there needs to be, I suppose, a look at the built environment, the facilities and equipment available. Also looking at the reasonable adjustment that they can make for the learning environment. So reasonably adjusting the learning environment, especially for neurodivergent people as well. So when we
Yep.
think of DEI, it's not just gender and gender equality and disability. It's different cognitive abilities as well to recognise it. But the key thing that I think is a challenge as well is also the learning resources and accessibility to learning resources. So one thing, now that the standards are going to be very explicit around diversity, equity and inclusion, is how do we design our learning resources? Are we applying the universal design for learning concepts? Are they WCAG compliant? Can we make sure that what we're designing is accessible for people visually impaired, hearing impaired, cognitively impaired? So I think they're the sort of things that training organisations need to start considering, so that they do have some thought as to how they make it an inclusive environment for everyone.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, what advice would you give to an organisation that's just starting to embark or just thinking about? So, we might have organisations that are thinking, oh, look, I want to create a more inclusive environment. I want to make sure that we have a diverse cohort of students or diverse employees. What are some advice that you might give to people who are just thinking about embarking on DEI?
Yeah. And having been there before, it's a bit scary when you don't know what you don't know. And one of the things that I did was do some research to start off with, had a DEI audit, and that really showed me where we needed to start and where we needed to focus. And as I said before, data is really key, and I think collecting data that's going to give you the benchmark of where you want to be, or the benchmark for where you are now, and then you can set your targets for where you want to be. That's the key thing for me. And there's some great resources out there. Diversity Council of Australia have some great resources, and it's not super expensive, but there's lots of tools out there that you can use, and start with the DEI audit and find out where you're at now and get some help in how to move forward.
Yep. Now, and obviously, different organisations have different needs. So we have smaller organisations; their DEI target's going to be very different to big multinational companies. For let's say CEOs or the compliance managers in organisations, what can they start doing now to start planning or thinking about different KPIs they can put into their organisation? Yeah,
that's a really good question. What have you seen?
Yeah, good. I suppose what I've seen is, it's got to come from the top. So, what my recommendation to CEOs is always thinking about, what are the key things that they see as barriers for different people of, different ethnic backgrounds, different genders, gender identity, sexuality and sexual identity, cognitive abilities as well, and what are the things that they need for those particular jobs. So it might start with recruitment. It might start with their facilities and their built environment. One of the things that I know, I was speaking to someone the other day where they've got some transgender employees, and there's issues around toilet usage. So, can we have unisex toilets in that built environment? And I think society is moving, especially in Western cultures, moving to more acceptance of, what DEI actually means and what diversity actually means. So, that's what I've sort of seen in those areas. And in terms of the industry sectors, have you seen any leading industries or sectors leading the way in DEI, and who can we sort of look towards to, the shining light of examples?
I've seen the way that Medibank actually do it, not to call them out, but they have a really good DEI strategy. They have employee resource groups where, employees, this is, a fairly big national company, and they have employee resource groups for a number of different diverse people. So they've got a Pride network and a First Nations network and a disability neurodiverse. And the engagement in those employee resource groups is excellent, and it's even more so when there's a leader that's part of that group, because there's a buy-in and there's a real sense that they're not alone and they've got a voice and an ally with someone in power. And I think they're one of the leaders that I've seen from a DEI space. What about you?
Look, it's interesting because I've seen large corporations take on DEI more so because they recognise the importance of having a diverse and equitable work environment. And I think it's also that sense of belonging that comes from it. So if we look at DI, what do we actually want to achieve from it, and what does it actually mean for organisations? And I suppose essentially we want to see organisations with a sense of belonging, and those larger organisations, listed on the stock exchange that have clear KPIs and want to achieve, and obviously want to attract new clients as well. And I think one of the stats that we've seen is that organisations that do adopt DEI practices actually have better share results. They have better revenue results because people and societies are attracted to them because they feel like belong. They identify with a brand. So I've seen those big, large multinational corporations embrace it and do it well. There might be a bit of diversity washing there.
Yep.
But I've also seen some more of those medium-sized organisations across different sectors because, again, I think they see the benefits of DEI and what it means to their organisation, what it means to productivity for their employees, what it means for recruiting the right people, attracting and retaining the right people in their organisations.
Yep.
And there was a study done, every year, but last year it was published that 90% of CEOs from large organisations have DEI in their top 10 risk areas. So how do they maintain a diverse, equitable and inclusive environment where their employees belong? And I think very particularly for our organisation, where we work with a lot of training providers and TAFEs and universities, they also need to create an environment where the students belong, where they're creating a great environment for students to thrive and reach their potential.
Yep.
So we've only got 2 minutes left, Julie. So we've had another question come through as well. How can leadership be held accountable for DEI outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I really think getting some leadership training for people to be inclusive leaders is just paramount. I think without that, they necessarily won't understand what it is to really champion it. And when diversity is being led from leadership, they will be held accountable because they'll be reporting to it. I think that's probably the key thing that's popped into my brain. What about you?
Look, I think, because it's a great question, thanks for putting that through, but I think leadership are held, ultimately leadership are held accountable by their stakeholders, and that's their customers, their staff, their shareholders. They're all the people that can hold the leadership accountable. I think leadership of organisations need to lead DI initiatives. I think they need to see the benefits for their organisation and be accountable to all of their stakeholders, to their employees, to their customers and clients, to their shareholders, and essentially, live and breathe the values of their organisation and that sense of belonging that we all achieve for.
Yep.
Any last bits of advice for our listeners in terms of DEI? What's some things they can do today to improve diversity in their organisations?
I think probably the key things for me would be look at your recruitment practices, look at, if you're an RTO or a training organisation, look at the way that you're recruiting and enrolling your students, and look at the way that you're using your language. They're probably the key things for me. You?
I can echo that. I think recruitment practices, tearing down those unconscious biases that we have, and especially for training organisations and universities, their enrolment process can sometimes be quite prohibitive and confusing for people with neurodivergence, for people who haven't been in a learning environment before. And that's what we've got to think about is, diversity means a lot of things to different people, essentially. So how can they break down those barriers and make it a diverse and inclusive environment for their students and their staff and all other stakeholders? But I think we've run out of time, Julie. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming to Ask the Auditor again. We're on every month for Ask the Auditor. Please put your questions through beforehand or as we're going along, and looking forward to seeing you next month on Ask the Auditor.